This is Biosphere, Seattle-based filmmakers, the Duplass brothers. Biosphere is a scientific experiment of the 80s and early 90s, flawed from the get-go because there's food coming in, there's air circulation, so it's not a true biosphere.
Are you not curious what's going on out there?
This really is the end of the world.
Let the isolation take its effect. Probably born out of the Duplass brothers sitting around being isolated at home and like, well, what could we do with 2 actors and a set?
What's going on with you? There's something else.
That's kind of cool. They took like a negative experience, turned into like, we have an idea for a movie.
This is a 2-hander. This is Biosphere. Anyone familiar with indie films, and especially Seattle-based, Washington State-based filmmakers, the Duplass brothers? There's Mark Duplass, and there's his brother, who I'm blanking on his name, but this is Mark Duplass. This is Us. He's the actor from This Is Us. He also, The West Wing went to HBO Max last year. They did a recreation of one of the more famous West Wing episodes. They needed a new actor to come in and play Leo. And this actor in Biosphere was the one who stepped into the role of Leo. It's funny. Biospheres were sort of a cultural experiment or scientific experiment of the 80s and early 90s. As a scientific experiment, it was flawed from the get-go because there's food coming in, there's air circulation, there's all kinds of... So it's not a true biosphere, isolated environment in the truest sense.
Yeah.
That being said, this one looks like it's taking that concept of a biosphere and you're taking 2 scientists and putting them in an isolated environment to work on whatever they're working on and let the isolation take its effect. So, like anything, if you like the Duplass brothers, if you like their indie films, this looks very much in line with their type of filmmaking. The whole idea of how much isolation we all went through with the pandemic and being socially isolated, physically isolated too, social distancing, that whole thing. This looks like a movie that was probably born out of the Duplass brothers sitting around being isolated at home and like, well, what could we do with 2 actors and a set? And this looks like a byproduct of that period of time in history and of that creative energy. So, anyone who's a Duplass brother fan, this movie looks really well done. I've obviously not seen it as of yet, but Biosphere is my number 8. Are you a fan of any of the Duplass brothers movies?
I actually, this is my first time, honestly, really hearing about them, to be honest. So you kind of showed me, like, about this, and that sounds really cool. And, like, I like how you said it's just, like, 2 people, like, with a set. It kind of reminds me of, like, The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and, like, Robert Pattinson, where they're literally just on that island, just by themselves, isolated. And honestly, like, I know COVID obviously was a really hard thing for a lot of people, the pandemic, but it's like, I think some people really, like, got really creative during that time. So if they're really basing off of that, it's kind of cool. They took, like, a negative experience, like, with what we all had to deal with and kind of turned into, like, we have an idea for a movie. So it sounds interesting. So I haven't seen the trailer for it. So after, every movie that you tell me about, I'm going to watch the trailers afterward.
You're from Washington State. I'm from Washington State. It's Seattle has its own culture, and it's physically isolated from the rest of the country. I always say Seattle is the place where characters in Hollywood movies either go to or come from some place that's far away, but still in the United States. Like,
I love that.
For example, when George Clooney left ER and was as a doctor, and where did he go to get as far away from Chicago as he could possibly go? He went to UW Medical Center. So Seattle, of the filmmaking community, original independent films come out of Seattle. The Duplass brothers are one of the major independent filmmakers that come out of Seattle. And what's funny is the films are always very quirky, and they're never really all that interesting visually. And I have no idea whether it's because it's cloudy 300 days a year in Seattle. I have no idea whether it's the focus on the character that's the real art. But the Duplass brothers put out a film once every year or two, and they're usually really well-defined characters. They're usually really funny. They usually get really good actors that you recognize. All that to be said, the Duplass brothers do a lot of good work. Altogether, the Seattle art scene produces a lot of good indie films.